One of the things I've noticed over 25 years in aquatics is that we are exceptionally good at preparing our teams for emergencies. We train, we drill, and we certify. What we haven't quite always figured out is what to do for our staff after the emergency is over, or how to build the kind of team culture that helps people weather hard moments together before they happen. That's the conversation we're starting today, and the good news is there's a practical place to start, one that any facility can act on right now, regardless of size. Keep listening.
Welcome to AOAP's Discussion from the Deep End podcast, where we share real stories and practical ideas to help you run safer, stronger aquatic programs and facilities. I'm Daniel Peters, your host, and I'm joined today by our co-host, Kirsten Barnes. AOAP is a nonprofit dedicated to improving aquatic education, recreation, and safety through training, resources, and community. In this episode, we're talking to Tyler Anderson, a designated aquatic professional, certified employee assistant professional, crisis intervention specialist, trauma response educator, and president of the International Lifeguard Critical Incident Response Alliance, where his work is centered on helping aquatic emergency responders and organizations better prepare for, respond to, and recover from critical incidents. But one of the most important parts of this conversation starts before a crisis ever happens. Through AOAP's partnership with Tyler, we've seen strong response in resilience first aid, a proactive training that helps people build resilience, recognize early signs of struggle, and support one another using practical mental wellness skills rooted in 6 domains of resilience. So today we're talking about what it means to support aquatic staff, not only after an incident in the water, but also in everyday realities of leadership, stress, peer support, and personal well-being, especially when so many of our team members are young people still developing the tools to navigate high-pressure moments in work and in life.
Tyler serves as president of the International Lifeguard Critical Incident Response Alliance, also known as ILCIRA, a nonprofit focused on supporting aquatic emergency responders through the challenges that follow critical incidents. He also brings extensive experience in crisis intervention, trauma response, peer support, and employee assistance, with a career that spans aquatics, aviation, and organizational support systems. Tyler also works with AOAP on the Resilience First Aid Peer Support Certification, a training that takes a proactive approach to mental health by helping people build resilience before crisis occurs. That practical, prevention-focused mindset is especially valuable in aquatics, where young staff members often need simple, usable tools to support themselves and each other. Tyler, we're so glad you're here. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience?
Thank you, Kirsten and Daniel, for having me on today. Just to tell a little bit about myself, I spend my time in two worlds that have more in common than most people might realize. At ILCIRA, I'm working to build the psychological preparedness infrastructure that aquatics professionals really have just never had access to. And at the airline, I'm sitting inside one of the most well-resourced critical incident response systems across many industries. I help to support crew members through their hardest days of their careers. Those two roles inform each other consistently. Every time I see what's possible when an organization really truly commits to supporting its people after a critical incident, it reinforces why this work in aquatics matters so much. Before my current role, I spent years managing emergency response and what they call business continuity planning at another air carrier. And what that really means is kind of thinking about how critical incidents not only, as just the response to the event, but also how the organization responds to the event as well. How do you, respond? How do you recover in a way that takes care of both, the continuity of the operation as well as the people that are running within it? That experience has shaped how I think about psychological preparedness, and it's not a wellness program per se. It's really more of an operational discipline. The organizations that really I feel like they get it right treat it exactly that way. The experience probably grounds the work more than anything else, is having managed operational planning for events like an aircraft hull loss or crash. That is among one of the most complex and really, emotionally demanding events that an organization could face. And it's really hard. And really, the hardest part is never really the logistics, it's all the human side of it. How do you support those families? How do you take care of the teams who are managing the response around the clock? How do you make sure the people doing that hard work in the worst moments don't carry it alone afterwards? I've been forced to sit with these questions in a very real way in some respects. And when I look at what aquatic organizations face after a critical incident, like a drowning or maybe a failed resuscitation, I see the same questions. The scale is different, but the weight really is the same. The lessons that I've learned from both worlds are the same. The organizations that hold together when something really awful happens are not the ones that figured it out at that moment. They're the ones that already had the culture, the language, and the support structures in place before anything went wrong. That's really not luck. That's preparation. It's exactly why ILCIRA is working with the aquatics industry to build a support infrastructure that can better support our aquatic professionals. I think one of the things I'm most proud of is that we just haven't taken what works in a large, well-resourced organization and handed it over to aquatics. We've done the work of synthesizing what are those best practices that we can take from emergency response, from business continuity planning, from critical incident support, and really building it into something that actually scales for us as aquatics professionals. A community pool with a seasonal staff of, let's say, 12 people, I feel like they should have access to the same quality of psychological preparedness, the frameworks that, a major theme park might have access to. And the tools might look a little different, but those principles, they're the same. There's been a core commitment from the beginning, and it's reflected in everything all the volunteers at ILCIRA are doing in partnership with the Association of Aquatic Professionals to help bring this level of support to the industry.
That's awesome. Tyler, to start, can you give us a little bit of an overview of ILCIRA and the work you've been doing to support aquatic emergency responders before, during, and after critical incidents?
Yeah, so, we really exist just to sort of close this psychological support gap that aquatic professionals have been left out of for really just too long. ILCIRA's work operates on two different tracks. The first is proactive, building resilience, and we call peer support capacity at the local facility level before a critical incident ever occurs. The second is reactive. That's where we bring in a structured International Critical Incident Stress Foundation based crisis intervention response team after an incident happens. And that, for us, is delivered through our accredited aquatic critical incident response team, which we are working on building out now in the industry. Those two tracks together make up what will be called in the future the Aquatic Professional Assistance Program, which will be a continuum of care designed specifically for the aquatic workforce. And one thing I kind of want to be, clear about is the aquatic professional assistance program that we're building. It's not going to be a replacement for an employee assistance program if you're lucky enough to have one of those at your organization. If your facility has an EAP, you want to keep it. It's an essential resource. What the research on first responder populations really has showed us is that EAPs alone are not sufficient. First responders need complementary peer support structures, people that speak the same language, who really understand the culture that we work in, and who are accessible in the moments right after something really bad happens. The EAP handles clinical referrals and covered mental health services. The Aquatic Professional Assistance Program fills that gap in between. The peer level, operationally grounded support that makes the whole system work. I like to say, that there's things that a peer can help you with to get past in the aftermath of a critical incident that a clinician, there's no way they can do that because they have no clue what you've been through and what your job is like. So ILCIRA also conducts and is participating in research on the psychological impact of critical incidents on aquatic professionals. The field really can't advocate for what we can't measure. And I think that's long been the case. There's been just numerous studies on first responder groups that have clearly demonstrated that police, fire, and EMS experience critical incidents in in their day-to-day work. And we really have not had those studies that have been accessible to aquatic professionals. So we are building that foundational research for the industry, and we're documenting the needs so that the infrastructure can follow. If you want to participate or follow along with any of our research, our current studies are always listed at ilcira.org on our website. And I think, general mental health resources don't speak this workforce's language, but what we're building that will. And we're building kind of the research foundation to prove that it works.
That's awesome, Tyler. There are so many pieces that come into play here. One thing we've noticed is that some organizations understand the need for critical incident response, right? And we do really good at that at the facility level, but they still struggle to make that leap into actually building those systems to support teams after they have an incident. Why do you think that gap exists?
Yeah, I think, the big barriers that we see are really the perception, resources, and probably a little bit to do with the culture as well. I think many facilities don't see themselves as kind of these high exposure environments, depending on whether you're at a pool, beach, water park. A pool that rarely experiences a resuscitation that may not feel the urgency. But a beach or open water team might see multiple high acuity rescues in a single season. The exposure profile is genuinely different across settings, and that variability, I think it makes it hard to build kind of this one size fits all sense of urgency. But I think what's important to understand is that regardless if you've had one event or you've had 5 a season, you still have to prepare your staff for that and have an appropriate response procedure in place. And there's something kind of specific to aquatics here. Lifeguards are trained, from day one to be that person who always stays calm when everyone else is panicking, just like other first responder groups. It's no different. This is what we train our staffs for. That identity is what our professional strength is as an aquatics professional. It becomes a barrier, though, when the incident's over and that same person needs to acknowledge, hey, you know what? This wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. This is pretty tough. That's kind of the very thing that makes people good at this job, but it can also make it harder to ask for help after. In most aquatic environments, I think there's this unspoken rule. You hold it together on the stand, you do your operational debrief afterwards, and then whatever you're carrying around, you deal with it on your own time. I don't know if that's necessarily malicious. It's just a culture that's developed because composure is genuinely essential to the job. It's something that it's been baked into us in our training process. But it means that the staff members who need the support the most often are the least likely to say so. And unfortunately, this is exactly what we see in other first responder groups. So we're able to draw some parallels from police, fire, and EMS, and extrapolate those over to aquatic first responders in our field. And then I think really there's a cultural component to this as well. And larger organizations and maybe theme park holding companies, the default response has been to send in an employee assistance program counselor. And I think that comes from the right place. But employee assistance program counselors don't know our world. They don't understand the culture. They don't understand our job. They don't understand the specific weight of what an aquatic professional carries after a critical incident. And we're unique. The fact that we are responsible for preventing those events, and not just responding to them like other first responder groups, that adds an additional layer of complexity to what we call sometimes a moral injury that occurs after an event. Kind of utilization tends to be low. I've talked to people at teams at water parks across the United States that have access to employee assistance programs, and they're not particularly well utilized, and they're really not received well as an initial response by the employees. It's not something that we should be surprised about. This is something that police, fire, and EMS found out about 20 to 30 years ago, and we're just catching up. And I think the framework that existed, required resources most aquatic facilities just simply don't have. It was a structural gap, not necessarily a failure the duty to act for the employer. I think closing that gap is what we're working on with the industry to do. And I think, proactive resilience work sidesteps all three of these. And, you don't need a crisis to justify being able to use resilience first aid and the skills that we teach. You don't need a big budget and you don't need a large team to start.
That's interesting, Tyler. Do you think that's part of why resilience first aid has resonated so strongly? Because it gives people kind of the entry point to something more practical and proactive that they can start using right then and there.
Yeah, exactly. I think resilience first aid meets facilities where they are. You don't have to have a full peer support program in place. You don't have to have experienced a major incident. You just have to be willing to invest in your staff's well-being in a practical and structured way. Kind of what I've seen when a team goes through resilience first aid training is something shifts in the culture. People start checking in on each other differently. Supervisors start kind of noticing things they might have missed before in their team members. That language around well-being becomes more normalized. And that's something that we know is a protective factor for lifeguards. In research, it's already been done with lifeguards out of Australia. One of the most common things I hear is we want to do something to support our teams, but we don't know where to begin. And the resilience first aid peer support certification that's where we begin here as an industry. It gives staff the skills to support each other, gives supervisors a framework for what healthy team culture looks like, and gives your organization the foundation of a legitimate peer support program accessible to a facility of any size. You don't need, a lengthy policy manual or a dedicated coordinator before you start taking the class. That's your first step to building the program. And, when something harder happens, the foundation's already there. That's what makes the next step possible. And we'll talk about that as we go along here in the show.
As a Gen Xer, I think that really hits home with me. You said earlier we kept all the emotions to outside. And this generation, and let's face it, aquatics professionals are working with young people, and they value mental health. And so I think creating a culture where we build that in strengthens our team in so many ways. So when you think about these aquatic teams, teenagers, college students, young professionals who maybe have limited life experience, but they're still being asked to step into these leadership roles, care for others, handle really stressful moments, not just critical incidents, but the stressful moments that happen at our facilities every day. How does that reality shape the way that you think about resilience and peer support?
Gosh, so this is a big question. Like, this shapes everything, and the research gives us a clear picture of what this population actually needs. The research is very specific. For lifeguards, proactive resilience education and skills training, it can strengthen protective factors that may reduce kind of what we call vulnerability factors to a critical incident. It also helps them support healthier recovery afterwards, helping people with what we call self-efficacy, which is the belief that you can handle anything that's kind of coming at you. And I don't know about you, but when I was, a kid, I don't think when I was an adolescent growing up, I didn't really have enough life experience to know that, I could navigate tough things in life at that point. And, having a trained adult peer that can help you walk through that process, that helps that person's self-efficacy. Then we talk about this thing called emotional regulation, the ability to manage what you're feeling without being overwhelmed by it. It also affects attention control, which we know is important with lifeguards in their surveillance duties, and just having that supportive peer connection. These aren't abstract concepts. They're exactly what resilience first aid is designed to build. And for an age group still developing these capabilities and capacities, a window to build them proactively is one we can't afford to miss. I know after I took the training program the first time about 2 years ago, I came away from it and I was like, this was all the stuff that I should have known at 18 being launched out into the world. It would have been so nice to have had, someone educating me about this. And that's what we hope aquatics leaders and our peer support teams that we're building can do with our teams in their in-service training. Moving on to kind of the research side of it, I think the research on the adolescent and young adult mental health is equally clear. Normalizing conversations around mental health and encouraging what we call help-seeking behavior are essential interventions for this population. They're not just soft additions to a wellness program that you can put a check mark in a box, in the HR department. This is real. Young people in high stress roles who don't have those norms established around them are significantly more vulnerable to the effects of cumulative stress and critical incident exposure. I like to, in all of my training classes, I use this analogy of a cup. And if you are walking around on a day-to-day basis with your cup, 90 to 100% full, and then you have a critical incident, that cup overflows, or anything very stressful, that cup overflows very fast. And what we know is the more that cup overflows, the more the traumatic imprint is, affecting that person. Traumatic memories get seared onto the brain. And so the more that we are helping people on a day-to-day basis to cope with stress and mitigate day-to-day life challenges, which we know can be tough for young people, then the more their cup is running at 70 or 80% full. So we've got a little bit of space to put things when the going is tough. And so that's really what RFA, the Resilience First Aid Program, that's designed to help us, build those norms in the language that really reaches this age group. I think when we're talking to let's say a 17-year-old in a guard chair who just worked some sort of resuscitation event, we can't assume that they've had any prior framework for processing what they've just experienced. Most haven't. And they may have never encountered death before or anything this severe. And I think they may not have the language for what they're feeling. They're often in a work environment where the cultural expectation is to hold it together and get back on the stand. We see this often in beach patrols where it's like, okay, you got to get back up there. I recently had an aquatics director share with me that his team was lifeguarding a marathon, and one of the individuals struggled and ended up going under, and a lifeguard had to respond. And uh, they ended up having to pull him out on a rescue board, paddle him in, do CPR, and then they had to jump back into the operation and go back out because a marathon doesn't stop just because there's an event that's occurred. And you know unfortunately, that aquatics director said, I learned a really hard lesson that day, that I need to have a backup team for my staff. I can't just assume that nothing's going to happen. And I think that's what we go through. Oh, nothing's ever happened. So, have you really planned for what is next? And so this is something that, Resilience First Aid builds from the start. I think when we don't support young staff through what they experience, how they experience, the consequences can show up, in turnover. Obviously, I hear from aquatics directors all the time that say we had an event, a staff member had to do CPR, and they just didn't show back up the next day. Whether that's because their parents said, you guys haven't provided them adequate support. I don't want my child responding to an event like this. We're being exposed to this without appropriate support services. I can't really blame them, to be quite honest, in that respect, but the consequences are real. There's behavioral changes that we see with staff, and that there's staff that leave aquatics entirely just because of one bad event, and that's really sad. I think there's this concept that we call post-traumatic growth, that if you help people after a critical incident in the right way, they will return back to their baseline in many respects and will proceed forward in a way that makes them even stronger as a person and more resiliently able to navigate adversity in life in the future. I think that there's a real organizational cost that rarely gets connected to the cause. And because it happens so infrequently in some aquatics organizations, it just gets swept under the rug. And that's really not okay. Building resilience protects people. We know this. And normalizing conversations that make it possible for them to ask for help, that's super important. For a young workforce, this industry depends on. We have to do this, and this has to all happen before that hard moment arrives. And I think we just have to keep that in mind. As I think what Resilience First Aid does, it helps the leadership and their peer support teams prepare their staff for that really tough day.
Yeah, like which is hard to do when you think about a kid or anybody realistically going to take a lifeguard class. Those aren't the things that come up. It's they talk about how to be a lifeguard, how to do things day to day, and it's after people are already hired and at a location when they kind of cover that stuff. So it's a big thing that I think needs to be talked about early, and it's not often discussed, like you said, until an incident happens, which is a shame in sometimes. But I guess for you, Tyler, what originally led you to connect crisis response work with this bigger idea of resilience, not just in terms of recovering from an incident, but kind of building establishing just a plan beforehand so that they don't have to deal with it on the fly when it does occur?
Yeah, Daniel, I think, when I look back on my work, it's been just experience. The teams that respond well are never the ones encountering support for the first time after an incident. Teams that respond well after a critical incident, they're almost never the ones encountering that for the first time. They're the ones who already had some foundation. They had some relationships. They had the language. They had psychological safety within their workplaces, and some sense of their own coping strengths, as well as our vulnerabilities. We all should have an idea of, this is what I'm good at, and this is what I'm not good at. This is where I need help. And to be able to ask for that help, that's super important. Post-incident support is necessary, but that shouldn't be the first conversation. I think the research on stress, what we call stress inoculation, and resilience building, and on peer support as a protective factor, it all points kind of in the same direction. That, in aquatics, where so many staff are young and where the culture makes vulnerability feel like weakness, starting those conversations proactively through training that's practical and relevant, not clinical, not like heavy language, that's where you can actually move the needle with this, this work group. An old emergency response manager colleague used to tell me, you can't build a house on a foundation you lay during the storm. And that's so true. You've got to plan at a time.
So, speaking of foundations, Tyler, let's talk more about Resilience First Aid. For someone who's hearing about this for the very first time, what is it? And really, how does it help aquatic teams?
Resilience First Aid teaches people to assess and support resilience, their own. And then as they build their own resilience through the program, they get to take a resiliency assessment at the beginning and the end of the class to see how much they're improving. And then it also allows them to improve their teammates in a practical, really just a human way. Resilience First Aid is built on what we call the PR6 model of resilience, which has 6 domains of resilience that research identifies as the building blocks of psychological well-being. So this was developed by a company called Driven Resilience, and ILCIRA delivers it in partnership with the Association of Aquatic Professionals, specifically for aquatics organizations. And this just isn't some generic wellness program. We have customized this specifically for aquatics. So you get the same core material from the Driven Resilience about the PR6 model and the domains of resiliency, but we've also baked in information on pre-incident education. How do you train your lifeguard staff on the items that they don't expect? In the clients that we've supported so far, we've already seen there's some really core factors that stick out with the lifeguards. And oftentimes it's surrounding things that we as lifeguard instructors didn't do a really good job preparing them for. So we have customized it to include that information. We also include a overview of critical incident stress management for aquatic leaders so that they know what critical incident stress management is. And I think for aquatic teams specifically, what makes it valuable is the focus on proactive actions. We're not waiting for something to go wrong. We're building that capacity now in your organization. So when the stress happens, whether it's a difficult rescue, a toxic team dynamic, or just a hard personal season that we all go through from time to time, people have the tools and each other. We're not waiting for something to go wrong. We're building that foundation before it does. And what we know is the more you build resilience ahead of time, the more resistant you are to critical incident stress.
Yeah, so it's just another form of preparedness, like and making sure that they're strengthening those 6 domains of resilience before they even hit that breaking point. So can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So let me kind of walk through this. So we have our 6 domains of resiliency, and this kind of guides how we navigate challenges in life. The first one is vision, which is all about purpose and direction, having kind of a sense of what matters and why you do what you're doing in life. For a young lifeguard, that may be as simple as understanding the real weight of what they're being asked to protect. Well, we move on to our next domain, which is composure. Composure is emotional regulation. It's not suppression, it's the ability to manage what you're feeling in a way that lets you function and make good decisions under pressure. We talk about how the brain works in that and really give you some really practical tools how you can get your brain back online to maintain composure in really tough circumstances. Then we move on to reasoning, which is how we make sense of difficult situations. It's kind of the cognitive piece. It's how we interpret events, how we attribute cause, how to avoid the kind of unhelpful thinking patterns that can spiral after a hard day or a hard event in your personal life. I think we've all been there where you have something happen and then your brain gets ahead of your body and all of a sudden the worst case scenario is coming out. So we give you some good tools to help there. Then we move on to tenacity, which is about persistence and adaptability under pressure. It's what keeps you going when a rescue doesn't end the way you hoped, or when the season gets long and hard, which we know in those months here in the United States, that, or in the Northern Hemisphere, July, August, it's like, staff start to lose attention. It's hot. And it's just, it can be, take grit to get through that season. So we give them some real good tools to use in that respect. Then we talk about collaboration as our next domain. Collaboration is kind of relational, the quality of our connections and our ability to give and receive support. For aquatic teams, this is huge, guys. This is your crew, it's built-in support network, but only if the culture allows it to function this way. You have to build a culture where nobody feels like they're going to be left behind. And this is something the early research out of Australia is showing us, with Australian lifeguards at Surf Lifesaving Australia, where 2 of our research team members are embedded into their organization. And they have found very clearly that this collaboration and the connections that people have in the workplace are very strong protective factors for lifeguard mental health. Then on the last domain we talk about is really foundational. This is what everything else is built upon. And many of these domains are hard to master if you have not got the next domain down. And the next one is health. It talks about, sleep, our physical well-being, the basic maintenance that underpins everything else. You cannot regulate your emotions or reason clearly when you're running on empty. And so we go through what are the best practices for sleep and physical well-being, and how do you make that applicable to your lifeguard staff? How can you have conversations at a pre-shift briefing or a post-shift briefing on these types of topics? And that's really what we do in all of these PR6 domains. Is each one of these domains has 4 skills that are taught, and the goal is to embed those skills that are taught into staff training, into staff meetings, a few at a time. And slowly over the course of the season, you're helping to build your staff's resiliency. Resilience first aid really helps people assess where they are across all 6 domains and recognize when a teammate is struggling in one of them, and it gives them the language to support them when they need some additional help to boost those resiliency skills.
I love this idea of taking something that we all have a little bit of surface level knowledge about and tying it all together in how it helps us just respond to the world around us. I think that's such a fantastic approach. And, in aquatics, we talk a lot about peer leadership, right? How can a frontline team member, and not just a supervisor, but someone who's on the front line, use this kind of training to be a positive influence on their team, maybe even team members who aren't familiar with the 6 domains or haven't taken the course?
Yeah. So, well, this model is not top down. You don't have to be a manager to be a resilience resource in your community. And in fact, we recommend that as a foundational piece when you're starting, to train at least one manager and one non-management peer that can start your peer support team, so that your staff have somebody to come to that's a non-management team member, that they don't have to worry about what they're going to tell the person is going to affect their employment in any way. And what, Resilience First Aid gives those frontline staff is a framework for noticing and the language for checking in. There's some really great resource tools that they can use, that most of our facilities that are using the program, they laminate and keep in staff rooms. And that, they're tools that are not clinical. It's just like, hey, you just seem off today. You don't seem like yourself. You're just not you. How are you doing? And that's often, enough to just open the door to get people to talk. And when people know what to look for across those 6 domains, they become more attuned to their teammates in a way that has a real impact. And that impact of that collaborative culture where you've got this family where people don't feel like, hey, you know what? This is my group and my team's not going to ever leave me behind. We look out for each other. That's what's important for us to foster in our organizations. That's something that we know is protective for other first responder groups, and already in the early research with lifeguards, it's shown us the same with aquatics professionals. The magic of peer support is its simplicity. You don't need a clinical background, you don't need a formal role, you just need the training and the heart to care. I think as people get into leadership positions, this concept of servant leadership and serving from the heart, from leaders, I think you foster that from your frontline employee. You want to foster that behavior so that when they do eventually move into management, that they're that kind of servant leader that we all would like to work with. Sometimes staff trust their peers more than they trust the person in the office. I think oftentimes that's the case. I definitely see this in the airline industry. People will not, our team members will not go to management with things. They come to the peer support team and we help them navigate, life's challenges. And then when it needs to be escalated to management, we're the first ones to say, hey, you know what? This exceeds our scope. We need to go pull in a manager to have that conversation. The Resilience First Aid Peer Support Certification takes that trust and it turns it into the capability to really make a difference. And that's what peer support the program is. And, every facility can build one. If you're, starting out, then you can, train 1 or 2 people. And then as you have more funding and your demand increases, you can always add more as time goes on.
You spoke about earlier, and so did Kirsten, our demographic is getting younger, and that's from our frontline staff to even some of our upper management. So having this in place, I'm sure benefits them having some comfortability going to that peer that's going to be relatively the same age as they are. But with that young staff that may not be ready for that formal crisis response language, is this the approach that makes it the most effective?
Yeah, I think a resilience first aid, it speaks in human language. It doesn't require anyone to identify as struggling, which this is key. Oftentimes, people have that ego factor and they don't want to admit that they need help or they're struggling. And, RFA does not carry clinical weight. It's framed around growth and building resilience, language that resonates with young people in a completely different way than saying we're teaching you stress management or mental health resources. So that distinction matters more than you might think it would. When I was an aquatics director at the facility level, you tell one of my 19-year-old staff members that this training will help you become more resilient and support their teammates. That just, maybe it lands a little bit differently then you tell them this is a mental health program. And I feel like at that point, you've lost half the room. People are making jokes, that sort of thing. So I think the framing matters enormously, especially with a population that's been conditioned to see asking for help as weakness. Yeah. So I think just young people want tools, and that's exactly what Resilience First Aid gives them.
I love that. Um, you talked a little bit about creating this culture where it's okay to be vulnerable, but on the flip side of that, what are some practical signs that your facility's culture is actually becoming more resilient? What changes would a manager start to notice?
I think the first thing I usually see, is that people just start checking in on each other naturally, not because you're told to. It's just something that you do because you care about the people you work with, and that's a cultural shift. That's one of the biggest things I see first show up. You also see it in how teams handle difficult situations operationally. Do people have language for what they just experienced? Is there space to acknowledge, hey, you know what? This is a pretty crappy day. Or does everyone just sort of move on and not mention it and move on? Everybody goes home kind of pissed off and, doesn't look forward to coming to work the next day. I think resilient cultures create that space naturally. And there's some key concepts that we discuss in our training program that are called resilient leadership principles. And I give you those core aspects synthesized down from. I took a 2-day class in resilient leadership, and so I synthesized all of that down into a couple of slides to be able to share kind of the take home message with our aquatic professionals. I think another sign is retention. Teams that generally invest in resilience tend to retain staff at higher levels. So that hits the bottom line right there. I mean, particularly across seasons. We saw this at facilities that I managed. When a young person feels genuinely supported, not just as an aquatics team member, but as a person, they come back. I had family members that their kids were really struggling, and they came to me and said, thank you, Tyler, thank you, thank you, thank you. Like, providing this type of environment is why my kid is thriving right now. And you know we had kids that were in, some of them had gone into inpatient programs because they were struggling, and just getting them reintegrated back into day-to-day life was helpful. And having a supportive culture where, what, we're going we've got you, you're part of our team, and we've got your back. They come back season after season because they feel like you cared about them. And I think managers who've been through the resilience first aid training, they respond differently. They don't just move on; they follow up. You have to create space for people. We work as aquatics professionals generally in resource constrained environments where we don't have a lot of time. We have more on our plate than is really reasonable in most other professions. Your most aquatics professionals, I say, are doing at least 3 to 5 jobs if you're working in a corporate, type of environment. And finding that way to say, oh, nope, this is something that we need to look at, and creating space for that person to have a conversation, uh, that's important. And that's kind of cultural modeling from your supervisors. People learn, and seeing you do that, you're teaching that future leader, that future employee, that future manager, how to be a good servant leader. This goes beyond just mental health. It's teaching people, what, how do you be a good employer, how do you be a good human, and how do you create a workplace that's psychologically safe.
And then you talked about it, and there's so much that kind of goes into an aquatic, I guess, facility organization. So being able to be proactive in all of our other areas kind of makes it so that the load isn't so much all at once. So I guess that kind of ties back into this. How does being proactive with resilience work actually make it easier later on for an organization to adopt more structured critical incident response practices through ILCIRA?
So I think the hardest part of post-incident support really isn't the training, it's the culture. When your team has never talked openly about mental wellness, Introducing this full crisis response team after a drowning feels really alien and uncomfortable. There's stigma, there's suspicion. Who are these people? Do we trust them? Why do we need this? You're introducing a wholly foreign concept at the worst possible moment. But if your team has already been through resilience first aid, they already have the language, they already have the trust, and they have the idea that supporting each other is part of the job. And then our aquatic critical incident response team that will be responding in the future as our teams deploy services across the United States will not be a foreign concept. It's just that next logical step. It's part of the plan. It's part of the foundation. That trust is there within your organization and with your employees. And I want to be direct with facilities listening to this. You don't have to wait until the program is fully built to call us. If a critical incident happens today, before we set up defined membership levels for people to join at to access the post-incident response services, we're not talking about resilience first aid at this moment. Right now, just call our emergency assistance hotline. You can find that number at ilcira.org on our website at the very bottom of the page. And our duty managers will walk you through this response step by step. At some point in the future, once we have the membership levels, then you will have to be a member to access services. But right now, I'll be honest with you, I haven't turned anybody away. Start with, resilience first aid. I think you build the culture when you're ready for the formal crisis response, and we'll build on that. And that having that peer support team at your facility and the leadership training that's been trained in resilience first aid, that's that first step of building that culture that I think it makes it easier for aquatics organizations to promote what's called post-traumatic growth with their team members. That, if you handle this well, your team will come out stronger after a critical incident, and more often than not, but you've got to handle it correctly. And we don't really expect the average aquatics director to be a pro at this. You don't do it enough to be an expert at this. This is why we're developing a team where you are calling us and we will assist you and walk you through the process with people that do this on a regular basis.
Gotcha. So they go hand in hand. In some ways, resilience first aid helps kind of build that foundation, and ILCIRA helps organizations prepare for the moments that the foundation is truly tested on.
Yeah, Daniel, exactly right. Resilience first aid builds the culture and the capacity, and the aquatic professional assistance program that we are building, you'll be able to complete that continuum of care in the future. The proactive side will be through resilience first aid, and that structured response side will be through the aquatic critical incident response team. So when something hard happens, organizations aren't starting from zero. But right now, today, any facility that needs to reach us, we're here. That's not changing.
Talk a little bit about kind of the lessons in the leadership of what this all entails. When you zoom out, what does this all teach us about the leadership in aquatics today?
I think the job's gotten more complex. Some psychological demands are really as real as the physical ones. Leadership in aquatics today, it means recognizing that your staff's mental wellness is not a soft benefit. It's an operational variable. Teams that are psychologically prepared, they perform better usually, they stay longer, and then they recover faster when hard things happen. I think preventative lifeguarding is, that's a sustained attention task. It requires continuous, uninterrupted focus on its own. The research across comparable high vigilance occupations, let's take, air traffic control, emergency services. There's people in the military that do surveillance. It's pretty consistent. When a person is carrying unresolved stress, whether from a critical incident, whether from just a difficult thing happening in their personal life, their capacity for that sustained focus, that can be compromised. So I think it may be, reasonable, if I'd be so bold, that, this possibly could be having the same effect on a lifeguard that's doing their surveillance duties. So they're physically on the stand, but are they cognitively there, or are they somewhere else? And, in most professions that can create, a bit of friction. And I think for us, it creates a gap really in protection. So the psychological wellness of your staff and the safety of your people that visit your facility, all of your guests, are not separate conversations in my mind. That's the same conversation. This isn't really abstract, but also, turnover is expensive. Absenteeism, that costs us. I know it hits our bottom lines. A staff member who's struggling after a critical incident doesn't really get support, doesn't just hurt themselves. They affect, other people. They affect how you're able to build rotations, your team dynamics, and put stress on other people that are left to pull their weight when they're gone. It also means modeling, I think, vulnerability as is for leaders in a way that doesn't undermine your authority. When you as a manager can say to your staff, hey, you know what? This is a really hard day, and I just want to check in with everybody. How are y'all doing? That's not weakness, dude. That is really that kind of servant leadership that builds cultures where people actually want to stay with you. When a manager is able to say that was a hard day and I just want to make sure we're all doing okay here, that's the leadership that I think people are looking for. And especially with this age demographic we're working with now, that's what they gravitate to. That's what they feel comfortable with.
Tyler, aquatic professionals are stretched so thin, right? We've got all the things happening. How do you, as we think about, making the case that mental wellness and resilience are not extras, we know that there's this kind of emerging conversation coming out around psychological risk that OSHA may start to say, hey, there's some responsibility that employers have. But for those facilities that aren't ready or don't have the resources to really dive into that, what's the best first step? Is it starting with awareness, resilience first aid, peer support? Is it starting with leadership training? Like, what's the first thing that I could do to really support my team?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the average aquatics professional, organization is starting with taking resilience first aid. You're going to get a lot of really great information that you can take back. And if you are that facility and you're resource constrained, give me a call. This weekend I've been on phone calls with several facilities that have reached out and said, "Hey, can you help me craft a plan for my facility this season?" And right now I'm at a point where I can do a handful of those a month with my schedule, and so reach out. But I do think that resilience first aid is accessible, it's practical, doesn't require a formal infrastructure to implement. It starts building that culture that makes everything else possible. It's a 3-year certification, so it's not something you'd have to invest in every year. It also gives leadership, this clearer picture of where their team is and where they need to be. From there, I think, awareness training for supervisors on recognizing what post-incident stress responses look like. Managers don't need to be clinicians. They just need to know what to look for and how to respond. We really, are encouraging aquatics managers not to be doing the post-incident response process because it takes training to do this correctly, and doing this in a team atmosphere where you have advanced referral mechanisms in case somebody is struggling, I think is really important. But I realize there may be a situation where we didn't budget this year for this. We'll be able to do this next year because I'm going to plan for it, but we can't this year. And we've had some facilities that have reached out and expressed those concerns, and I've set things up for them where they can, fundraise in their community. They can do a little community fundraiser to build their peer support team to support their lifeguard staff, so that there really isn't an excuse to say I can't do it financially. Where there's a will, there's a way. We can help you get there. You just have to be creative about it. I think that peer support foundation at the facility level and training staff to recognize the signs of stress in their teammates and building that internal capacity to support each other before and after a difficult incident, that's important. And through it all, just know that right now we're there if you need us. If you call me, call the emergency assistance hotline, one of our duty managers will guide you through that step. It, and then in the coming years, you will see different membership levels that will be posted that you'll be able to join at. So just keep cognizant of our website and the AOAP's website. There'll be more information, and follow us on social media on our Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram pages, and you'll see more information coming out about that. But I want to also say this very plainly, we cannot do this alone. ILCIRA can build the infrastructure. AOAP can help carry out our message and help us with engagement. But, the research partners are going to be helping us document. But this change only happens if each aquatics organization, each director, each facility manager, each lifeguard certification agency decides to dig in. Everyone listening to this right now is part of that. You don't have the perfect program. There's going to be, bumps along the way. That's to be expected. You don't have to have all the answers, but you got to be willing to start that conversation and to commit resources to being part of building something the industry has needed for really a really long time. Every one of you listening is part of what makes this possible, and I thank you for that. There's been so many people that have reached out. We've had great industry partners like the AOAP that have been willing to step forward to help this get started for the industry. This is an industry effort, and it deserves an industry solution.
Yeah, I think it's great to being able to discuss it, especially for our listeners that aren't necessarily going to, I guess, feel, for lack of a better term, feel that they're going to be in that position anytime soon. So this kind of starts that conversation and gets like people proactively thinking about it, which I think is awesome because, like you said, it's you can never be too prepared for something like this, especially something that critical.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to jump into some lightning round questions, quick answers. All right, Tyler? All right. What's one thing any aquatic facility can do this month to rebuild resilience on their team?
No, I mean, we've already hit this home. I feel like we've hit this horse hard. That take resilience first aid. I think also talking to your staff about mental wellness, about mental health, normalizing that behavior, having discussions regarding what are our plans after a critical incident. Those types of things are important. You're going to get a toolkit as well as that contains a lot of cool things you can use to talk to your teams about resiliency in that resilience first aid peer support certification manual. You'll get posters you can use. So those are things that you can use during your staff in services. That's what I hope you do. That you use it during pre-shift briefings. If you take the class and you just let it sit on the shelf, you're doing your team no. It's a disservice. Exactly, Daniel. It's something that it has to be an actual living document, or a living, not a document, but a living program within your organization that you are really, pushing.
So you talked a little bit about kind of physical resources. What's one mindset shift that you wish more aquatics leaders would make when it comes to staff mental health?
Let's say, I guess maybe stop treating it as just maybe separate from operations. It's not a wellness initiative for people that have an occupational duty to respond. It's a performance and retention strategy. Lead from that understanding, and then everything else I think will get easier.
Yeah, we talked about it before, that peer support is essential when it comes to this type of job, especially with our demographic. What makes peer-to-peer support so powerful, especially with these younger staff?
Yeah, I think it's just trust. Young staff trust their peers in a way they don't trust management oftentimes. A peer with the right skills can open doors that no formal program ever could. I've gotten so many phone calls from a friend with somebody that's struggling, and they call me and say, somebody's struggling, and can you help them get through this? And it's been that friend that's made that first call with them to help them make that first step.
I love it. You've been doing resilience first aid for a while now. What's one reason you think it's connected so well with aquatic professionals?
I think it meets all of us kind of where we are. First of all, it helps you build your own resilience. I personally took the class, and I took the skills and the report and found the skills that I was kind of lacking in, and I worked on one or two a month for about a year so that my score raised up to above 85%, which we know is protective of mental health disparities and critical incident stress. So that is something that you can use yourself and then take to your staff members. I think that just the framing of that, and you explaining that to your staff, that makes all the difference.
Yeah, I think this information is great. Tons of resources, but I think what's the one resource every aquatic leader should explore to better support staff well-being and recovery?
I think you can use a lot of the things on our website on ILCIRA.org. There's a resources tab that has crisis hotlines all around the world. We'll be adding more information. There is a portal or a Facebook group right now that you can use if you have taken Resilience First Aid that has a litany of resources and materials that you can use with your staff, social media posts, and just to send a text to your staff in this Facebook group you get access to when you take Resilience First Aid. But I mean, there's a lot of resources just on our website that are free to anybody. And they link off to other resources. One of them, the crisis text line, has a great website that has vetted resources that's on their website, and you can link to that from ours. And that's a great resource for anybody to have in their back pocket.
Tyler, we hear from facilities that already have an employee assistance program. Does that mean that they don't need aquatic professional assistance program?
Not at all. I'd flip that around. If you have an EAP, an employee assistance program, because I know that oftentimes gets confused with emergency action plans and aquatics. The aquatic professional assistance program that we're building makes it work better. First responders have seen this. Generally, EAPs are not what they want to see. And people that have an occupational duty to respond, the EAP works hand in hand with a peer support program. It does not replace it in any way, shape, or form. So the peer support layer is the bridge. They aren't competing with each other. They're designed to work together hand in hand. You need both. I realize some facilities don't have the financial means to be able to have, a big employee assistance program from like Aetna, United Healthcare, or, other leading national network employee assistance programs. And so that's what we're trying to build, is a program that can assist people with additional referral resources within our organization that will be peer run, that can help us help as many people as possible. And then when we need somebody to, connect with a clinician, we're working on additional national support resources that they'll be able to do so.
All right. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing not only your expertise, but also such a practical and human perspective on supporting aquatic professionals.
This conversation is such an important reminder that resilience doesn't begin after a crisis. It begins long before one, in the way that we prepare our teams, support our people, and build healthy cultures.
Yeah.
We will link the ILCIRA and Resilience First Aid in the show notes so you can learn more about these tools and resources that we can support our team. And anything else you want us to include, Tyler, we'll include it as well.
Okay. Yeah, just keep paying attention to the ILCIRA.org website and aquaticpros.org, where we have our Resilience First Aid Peer Support Certification posted, and additional plan options as the Aquatic Professional Assistance Program rolls out in the coming years will be posted there. Thank you so much, Kirsten and Daniel, for inviting me to come speak today, and I appreciate the opportunity to get the information out to the aquatics community.
Absolutely. And if our listeners today, if this episode resonated with you, share it with another aquatic professional so that we can keep this conversation going.
To learn more about AOAP's training, conference opportunities, and drowning prevention resources, visit aquaticpros.org. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on AOAP's Discussion from the Deep End podcast, made for aquatic professionals by aquatic professionals.